One second I was stepping through what I thought was solid ground. The next I was plummeting through rotting wood and centuries of decomposed leaves into a void that shouldn't exist. The forest floor gave way like a trapdoor, and I fell 12 feet into darkness so complete it felt like being swallowed alive. My breath comes in ragged gasps that echo off invisible walls, each exhale a desperate cloud of vapor in the suddenly frigid air. Pain shoots through my left ankle where it twisted during the fall, but that's nothing compared to the ice-cold terror spreading through my chest as I realize where I am. This isn't just a sinkhole or natural depression. This is something else. Something wrong. Above me, the opening I fell through looks impossibly small, a distant patch of gray sky barely visible through the canopy. The walls around me feel carved, deliberate, like I've stumbled into some ancient chamber that the forest has been hiding for decades. The sounds hit me first. The normal symphony of Itatiaia's rainforest, the calls of toucans, and the rustle of howler monkeys, the constant whisper of wind through a million leaves. But as minutes pass in this hole, those familiar sounds begin to fade, replaced by something that makes my skin crawl. Silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping forest, but an unnatural vacuum of sound that presses against my eardrums like cotton. Then I hear it. Movement. Subtle at first, like branches shifting in a breeze that doesn't exist down here. But the rhythm is wrong. Too purposeful, too calculated. Something is moving just beyond the edge of my vision, circling this pit, testing my vulnerability. I press my back against the damp wall and try to control my breathing, but every instinct screams that I'm being watched, studied, evaluated by something that shouldn't exist. The darkness seems to pulse with malevolent intelligence, and I realize with growing horror that falling into this hole wasn't an accident. I was led here. And now, as my flashlight begins to flicker and die, I understand that the most terrifying day of my life has only just begun. 3 weeks ago, my life was beautifully simple. I'm Dr. Carlos Silva, a field biologist specializing in Atlantic forest ecosystems, and I'd been granted a rare solo research permit to study endemic bird populations in the remote sectors of Itatiaia National Park. My days followed a comfortable routine: wake at dawn to the calls of rufous-bellied thrushes, brew coffee on my portable burner, and spend hours documenting species behavior in areas most tourists never see. I was particularly focused on tracking the endangered three-toed jacamar, a bird so elusive that confirmed sightings were considered minor scientific victories. My small research station, a weathered cabin 40 minutes hike from the nearest trail, felt like paradise for someone who'd spent too many years trapped in university lecture halls. Each morning I'd check my mist nets, record temperature and humidity readings, and update my field journal with meticulous observations about feeding patterns and territorial disputes among the local bird communities. The work was exactly what I'd dreamed of since graduate school: meaningful, solitary, and surrounded by some of the most biodiverse forest on Earth. But after the first week, I started noticing inconsistencies in my data that didn't make sense. Birds would abandon territories they'd defended for days. Entire flocks would go silent for hours at a time, and I'd find my equipment moved or tampered with despite being miles from any human presence. I mentioned these anomalies to park rangers during my weekly supply runs, but their responses were always vague, accompanied by nervous glances and quick changes of subject. One ranger, an older man named Jerome who'd worked the park for 30 years, finally pulled me aside and whispered about researchers who'd gone missing in remote sectors over the decades. He showed me incomplete incident reports, journal entries that ended mid-sentence, and voice recordings that cut off abruptly during routine observations. Jerome's hands shook as he pointed to locations on my map, areas he claimed were avoided by local wildlife and experienced guides alike. I should have listened to his warnings, should have recognized the fear in his eyes. Instead, I convinced myself these were just local superstitions, the kind of folklore that develops around any isolated wilderness. That arrogance nearly cost me everything. I was following what looked like an old animal trail, tracking a pair of jacamars that had been calling from deeper in the forest than I'd ever heard them before. The path seemed solid enough, covered with the typical carpet of decomposing leaves and fallen branches that characterizes the Atlantic rainforest floor. I remember taking one confident step forward, my weight fully committed, when the earth simply disappeared beneath my feet. The sensation was surreal, like stepping off a cliff in complete darkness. My stomach lurched as I dropped through what I now realize was a layer of rotted vegetation covering a hidden cavity. Time stretched impossibly as I fell, my mind processing the impossible reality that solid ground had become empty air in the span of a heartbeat. The impact came hard and wrong. My left ankle twisted violently as I hit the bottom, sending lightning bolts of agony up my leg. My shoulder slammed against what felt like stone, and the air exploded from my lungs in a painful gasp that echoed in the confined space. For several minutes I couldn't move, couldn't think beyond the white-hot pain radiating from multiple points on my body. When I finally managed to push myself into a sitting position, the world spun sickeningly around me. Blood trickled from a gash on my forehead where I'd struck something sharp during the fall. My left hand was scraped raw, and every movement sent fresh waves of pain through my twisted ankle. Worse than the physical damage was the complete disorientation. I had no idea how deep I'd fallen or where exactly I was in relation to my familiar research area. The opening above me was barely visible, a distant rectangle of gray light that seemed impossibly far away. My backpack had spilled its contents during the fall, and I frantically felt around in the dim light for my emergency supplies, my hands shaking from shock and the sudden bone-deep cold that seemed to emanate from the walls around me. As I struggled to inventory my situation and assess my injuries, a terrible realization crept over me. I was completely alone, injured, and trapped in a place that didn't appear on any map I'd studied. No one knew exactly where I was, and my next scheduled radio check wasn't for 2 days. After struggling to climb out of that pit for hours, I finally managed to pull myself up using exposed tree roots, my ankle screaming with every movement. Limping through the unfamiliar forest, I discovered something I hadn't expected: the ruins of an old research station, half swallowed by decades of vegetation growth. The collapsed roof had created a natural shelter where previous researchers had apparently stored equipment and documentation. Inside, protected by plastic sheeting and metal containers, I found a treasure trove of materials that would have excited any scientist under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. The field journals dated back to 1987, written by Dr. Helena Vargas, a botanist who'd been studying rare orchid species in this exact area. Her early entries were methodical, professional, filled with detailed observations about plant communities and soil composition. But as I read deeper, her tone shifted dramatically. She wrote about equipment going missing, about finding her specimens rearranged in patterns she couldn't explain, about sounds in the forest that didn't match any known animal. More disturbing were the audio recordings I found, cassette tapes labeled with dates spanning 3 decades. Different researchers, different voices, but the same escalating fear. Dr. Vargas from 1987 describing something watching her from the tree line. Dr. Roberto Santos from 1994 whispering about shadows that moved independently of their sources. Dr. Anna Costa from 2001, breaking down completely as she described finding her colleague's notebook filled with drawings she'd never seen him make, sketches of something with too many eyes and limbs that bent wrong. Each recording ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as if the speakers had simply vanished while documenting their experiences. The topographical maps revealed the most chilling pattern of all. Red X marks indicated disappearance sites, clustered around specific coordinates that formed an almost perfect circle around this area. Notes scrawled in different handwriting referenced the same phenomenon across 40 years. Researchers drawn to investigate anomalous readings, experiencing progressive psychological deterioration, then disappearing without trace. What terrified me most was realizing that every account described the same presence, something that defied description, but left identical psychological fingerprints on every witness. As I sat surrounded by decades of documentation, I understood with growing dread that I wasn't just lost in the forest. I'd become the latest entry in a mystery that had been consuming researchers for generations. That first night in the ruined research station changed everything. I'd set up my sleeping bag in what remained of the main room, barricading myself behind overturned tables and fallen beams. But sleep was impossible. Around midnight, the sounds began. A rhythmic scratching against the exterior walls, like massive claws testing the structure's integrity. The scratching would stop whenever I held my breath to listen, resuming only when I exhaled, as if something was monitoring my breathing patterns. By dawn, I'd found deep gouges in the wood outside, marks that were too large and too deliberate to be from any native animal. The second night brought worse violations. I'd carefully arranged my equipment in specific positions before sleep, a habit drilled into me during years of field research. When I woke, everything had been moved, not scattered or damaged, but repositioned with surgical precision. My water bottles formed a perfect circle around my sleeping area. My notebooks were stacked in a pyramid that defied the random way I'd left them. Most unsettling, my backup flashlight had been placed upright in the exact center of the room, pointing directly at where my head had rested. The footprints appeared on the third day. I found them pressed into the soft earth around the station, prints unlike anything in my extensive zoological training. They were roughly human in size, but wrong in every proportion. Too wide, with what appeared to be elongated digits that ended in sharp points. The stride length suggested something that moved with an unsettling gait, placing each step with deliberate calculation. I followed the trail until it simply vanished at the edge of a stream, as if whatever made them had dissolved into the water itself. The sensation of being watched became constant, a psychological pressure that made my skin crawl and my vision blur with paranoia. Cold drafts would suddenly sweep through the station despite the complete absence of wind outside. My flashlight beam would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that seemed to dart between trees with impossible speed and agility. The temperature would drop 20 degrees in seconds, turning my breath to vapor even during the warmest parts of the day. By the fourth night, my hands shook constantly, and I'd developed a nervous tic of checking over my shoulder every few seconds. Then I found it, my red field notebook, the one I'd been writing in just hours before, sitting open on a fallen log 50 meters from the station. The pages were filled with sketches I'd never drawn, detailed anatomical drawings of something that looked almost human, but fundamentally wrong. But here's what shattered my last hold on sanity. I hadn't left the station since the previous morning. I'm losing my mind. I have to say that up front because what I'm about to tell you defies everything I know about reality. The eyes started appearing on the fifth night, massive and unblinking, floating in the darkness beyond my flashlight's reach. Not animal eyes, not human eyes, but something that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. When I'd point my light directly at them, they'd vanish, but I could feel them watching from impossible angles, above me, below me, inside my peripheral vision where they shouldn't be able to exist. Then came the voices. My mother's voice calling my name from the forest, so perfect in its inflection that I actually stood up and started walking toward it before catching myself. My thesis advisor, Dr. Martinez, discussing my research findings in his exact academic tone, conversations we'd never had about discoveries I'd never made. My ex-girlfriend, Maria, whispering my name with the same tenderness she'd used during our last phone call 3 years ago. Each voice would fade just as I got close to the source, leaving me standing alone in the dark, questioning my own sanity. Time became fluid, meaningless. I'd check my watch at what felt like noon and see that it was midnight. I'd sit down to eat breakfast and suddenly realize I was holding a can of food I'd opened for dinner. My journal entries began appearing in handwriting that looked like mine but described events I couldn't remember experiencing. Entire days would pass in what felt like minutes, or minutes would stretch into eternities of terror and confusion. I started talking to myself, having full conversations with voices in my head that sounded increasingly unlike my own internal monologue. The paranoia consumed everything. I became convinced that the trees were repositioning themselves when I wasn't looking, that the station walls were gradually closing in, that my reflection in puddles showed someone else's face. I'd spin around suddenly, certain something was directly behind me, only to find empty air that somehow felt occupied. My hands developed a constant tremor, and I couldn't eat without my stomach rejecting every bite. The boundary between waking and sleeping dissolved completely. I'd find myself standing in the forest at dawn, with no memory of leaving the station, my feet bloody and my clothes torn. Reality had become negotiable, and I was losing every negotiation. It's happening now, it's happening. The walls are breathing. The station is alive. I can hear my heartbeat in the floorboards, and something is coming. Something massive is approaching through the tree's branches, snapping under impossible weight, and I have to choose. I have to decide now. Because staying means facing whatever has been hunting me for days, but running means navigating miles of hostile forest with a twisted ankle, and no guarantee that I won't just circle back to this cursed place like the others did, like they all did. The voices are screaming now, all of them at once. My mother, Dr. Martinez, Maria, even voices. I don't recognize children crying for help. Researchers begging me to join them, to stop running, to accept what's coming, and my hands won't stop shaking. My vision is tunneling, the edges going black and white spots dancing across everything I try to focus on. But focus is impossible when reality keeps shifting, when the trees lean inward like they're listening, when my own shadow moves independently, when I can smell decay and copper, and something sweet and rotten that makes my stomach heave uncontrollably. I've been awake for how long? Days, weeks. The journal says it's been 12 days, but that's impossible. I only have 3 days of supplies left, or did I eat them already, or did something else eat them? Memory fragments, cascading images of myself, standing in the forest at midnight, having conversations with things that aren't there, writing in languages I don't know, drawing anatomical sketches of creatures that shouldn't exist, and the scratching is back, louder now. Methodical. Like it's following blueprints written in some alien mathematics. The walls shake with each impact, and I can see cracks forming, spider webbing across the ceiling as whatever is outside tests the structural integrity of my last refuge. My ankle throbs with each heartbeat. But that pain is nothing compared to the pressure building in my skull. The knowledge that I'm approaching some kind of event horizon, some point of no return where the choice will be made for me, where passivity becomes complicity, and the eyes are back, dozens of them floating in the darkness beyond the broken windows, reflecting my failing flashlight, like stars in a polluted sky. And they're patient, so patient. They've been waiting for this moment, for me to break completely, to surrender to whatever logic governs this place, and I can hear my own voice now calling from outside the station. My own voice begging me to come outside, to stop hiding, to accept what I've become. And the terrible realization hits me that I might already be gone, that I might be the one doing the calling, that the thing outside wearing my voice might be more real than the thing inside thinking these thoughts, and I have to choose. I have to move, because the scratching has stopped, and that silence is worse than any sound. They found me 3 days later, wandering the main trail in clothes that weren't mine, carrying equipment I didn't remember packing. The rescue team said I kept asking about someone named Helena, insisting we had to go back for the others. They told me I'd been missing for 2 weeks, but my journal only shows 12 days of entries, and some of those are written in handwriting that the psychiatrists say belongs to me, but that I swear I've never seen before. The doctors ran every test imaginable: dehydration, mild hypothermia, superficial cuts and bruises consistent with prolonged forest exposure. But they couldn't explain the drawings I'd made, anatomical sketches of things that don't exist in any taxonomy. They couldn't explain why soil samples from my clothes contained organic compounds that shouldn't occur naturally in Atlantic rainforest ecosystems. Most importantly, they couldn't explain why satellite imagery of my research area now shows vegetation growth patterns that spiral inward toward coordinates that match exactly with the location of that ruined station. I don't sleep well anymore. Every night I wake up to the sound of scratching at my apartment walls, but when I check, there's nothing there. Sometimes I catch myself standing at my window, staring toward the mountains where Itatiaia lies hidden in the distance, feeling a pull I can't explain or resist. The nightmares are always the same. I'm back in that station, but I'm not alone anymore. There are others there, researchers from decades past, and they're all smiling at me with eyes that reflect light in ways human eyes shouldn't. They tell me I belong with them, that I never really left, that what came back wasn't entirely me. I've tried to convince myself it was psychological breakdown, isolation, psychosis, anything rational. But then I look at those drawings in my journal, sketches of anatomical details I couldn't possibly know, and I remember fragments of conversations with something that spoke in my mother's voice, but knew things about me that I'd never told anyone. To any researcher considering remote fieldwork in protected areas, especially in regions with histories of unexplained disappearances, trust your instincts. If the local wildlife goes silent, if you find evidence of previous researchers that isn't in any official record, if you start hearing voices of people you know calling from the forest, leave immediately. Don't try to document it. Don't try to understand it. Just run. Because some things in the wilderness aren't waiting to be discovered. They're waiting to discover you.